So good day, everybody. Thank you so much for joining this webinar, which I hope you can all see is on clinical trials access in Europe, specifically in the context of influence of the proposed revisions to the EU pharmaceutical legislation. My name is Neil Bettridge. I'm the Senior Director of the European Alliance for Patient Access, which is the European division of the Global Alliance for Patient Access. And I'll say a few words, very brief words, about our organisation in a moment to introduce what we do. So the Alliance, both here in Europe and across the world, is a non-profit organisation really designed to promote discussion around policies which promote better access to medical devices, to pharmaceuticals, to self-management support, whatever it is that patients need and want. And our ethos is very much around promoting individualized care, person-centered care, rather than disease-centered care, on the basis that we're all unique, and the healthcare system should be able to be flexible enough to respond to people's clinical and other needs effectively. To do this, we convene stakeholder experts ranging from policymakers, clinicians, patient representatives, medical societies, and so on. And typically we'll convene policy workshops to develop a common agenda around policy issues of common concern and to figure out what we might be able to do together in separate communities to address unmet needs that patients may have. So this may be focused on a specific disease or condition, or on a specific topic such as shared decision-making, or in today's case, of course, clinical trials. So we're not the specialists on any one disease or any one topic, but we work with the experts who are. And today we're addressing an issue that many of our network members have raised with us over the last year, which is clinical trials generally. We have an initiative I'll introduce in a few moments, but actually the potential impact, foreseen or otherwise, of the current legislative review on pharmaceuticals. So over the last year or so, we've launched a global clinical trial awareness campaign, largely, I think, because the more we looked into the issue, the more shocked we were at how many barriers to the optimal delivery of trials, design, delivery, and onward implementation, and also the extent to which patients could and should be shaping them. So this webinar is part of the global campaign delivered through the European Alliance. So specifically for this webinar today then, our primary objectives, and I hope you share them, is to identify the benefits of clinical trials for patient outcomes, but also to look specifically at the challenges and the opportunities in the context of the current pharma legislation review. And we know that the consultation for all stakeholders is being extended now, I think, a couple of times until November. So clearly, there's a whole range of important perspectives that need to be aired if what develops ultimately is going to be something at least acceptable to everybody, and hopefully something more positive than that. And with this in mind, we want to be constructive. We want to try to identify policy solutions, ideally, or at least issues which need to be addressed at policy level if we are to avoid any adverse, unforeseen consequences. And with that in mind, there's a whole range of stakeholders, including those of you who've joined on the call, that we need to hear from. Not least, of course, those directly affected, industry and not-profit organisations, and patients indeed. So the agenda has been constructed with all that in mind. I won't go through each speaker now, as we'll clearly do that as we introduce each. And you'll note, apart from 3 presentations, we've also invited a short informal response from the European Patients Forum. Delighted to have Julie here to do that. We know that there will be issues arising during the discussions from the presenters that pick up the patient and care and family perspective, but it'd be really important, I think, to get a quick overview of the issue and the presentations from the EPF today. So thank you, and thank you all for taking time to join us. And I think from my side, I just want to say a couple of issues about the topic before I hand over to the speakers. We are sort of largely agnostic at the European Alliance for Patient Access. We're trying to promote the conversation, really. We're not by any means the experts on this topic, but what some of the issues that have been raised with us and which we want to highlight a little bit is what the Commission's stated objectives are and what they might mean. So just as a couple of examples, top line, there is a strong message that the legislation review is intended to support, favour and incentivise companies that are involved in comparative clinical trials. And there's a lot of reference to those that specifically address unmet clinical need. So maybe there's something there we need to explore around the definitions. We know that there's some discussion going on in different quarters about the levels of data protection that companies can enjoy as a result of the new proposed framework. I think it's a minimum of 8 years being proposed, but actually that could be extended in some cases according to where the product may be launched or to what extent it addresses unmet need. So probably a few things to clarify and unpick around that. And sort of connected to that, of course, is the proposal around the regulatory data protection system itself. So there's talk of promoting quicker access to for example, biosimilars and generics where these are available, but where there can still be delays occurring. But, you know, the Commission really is stating that all of this is designed to strike a balance between promoting innovation and enhancing patient access. And it's that issue, of course, that we at the European Alliance for Patient Access are most interested in. So I think that's enough from me, because our speakers will shed a lot more light than I can on this. And so first up, it's a great pleasure to introduce, I should also mention that your questions are very welcome, and please put them in the chat, and there's a question and answer session at the end. I may pose a couple of questions to the speakers along the way. Let's see how we go. So now I can formally introduce Elizabeth Kuiper, who's an associate director at the European Policy Centre, and who's going to talk to us, as your title says, addressing the topic full on. So Elizabeth, over to you, please.
Thanks so much, Neil, for your introduction, and good afternoon to all of you. It's really a pleasure to be here this afternoon, because not only because of the fact that the topic is very important, but also since the topic is close to my heart personally, because in my previous capacity as health attaché for the Dutch permanent representation, I have been involved in negotiations of the clinical trials directive, the clinical trials regulation, I have to say, which is still not fully implemented, and which I think is a topic that we're going to go back to this afternoon, because I think that is a very important topic when we speak about the importance of clinical trials for Europe. I think from a think tank perspective, because European Policy Centre is a Brussels-based think tank, it is important to also look first, before we dig deeper into the specificities of the proposed EU pharma legislation and its impact on the revision of the clinical trials, on the broader context. And I think it's very important to remind ourselves of the fact that when President von der Leyen, when she started her mandate in December 2019, had a very specific vision on the pharmaceutical industry, because it was for the first time ever that a Commission President proposed a pharmaceutical strategy. And even now, we're all, of course, since November 2020, when she actually then proposed the strategy and when it got adopted by the European Commission, used to the fact that there is this strategy. So far, there had been a lot of strategies for different sectors, for the energy sector, for the transport sector. But in a way, it was very surprising that never the European Commission had proposed a pharmaceutical strategy. And I think that shows you the importance, and I think it links back to what you said before about the current day and age we're living in, where it's very important to find a balance between innovation and patient access. And I think especially with new technologies, gene therapies and what have you, I think it's more important than ever that to strike that balance. I think at the same time, it's also important to realize that the world is a very different place compared to when President von der Leyen proposed this idea of having a pharmaceutical strategy in December 2019. Because in the current world we're living in, we're confronted with a lot of interconnected challenges. We're still dealing with the post-COVID impacts. And again, that started only a few months after President von der Leyen started her mandate. We have to do with geopolitical tensions due to the Russian invasion in Ukraine. I think changing demography is also a really important point to mention because that means that we're not only confronted with an aging population, but also with an aging workforce. And I think if we speak about the skills also needed to deal with clinical trials and with future innovation, I think it's very important that we also think about the health workforce and to what extent we're really upskilling and reskilling as needed. And I think it's really interesting to realize that health, security, and climate change are deeply connected and also central to the notion of strategic open strategic autonomy, which is a term that is used very much in the current geopolitical context, but is oftentimes not really defined when it comes to the health and pharmaceutical sector. And there still seems to be a lack of understanding, despite a global pandemic, of the importance to keep a more industrial strategy close to patient access and public health. Because oftentimes at European level, also if you look at the European Commission, you have DG Grow at European level that is dealing with more industrial issues, whereas DG Santé is dealing with public health. And the fact that actually one needs a life science infrastructure and an ecosystem so that indeed new medicines get developed so that they actually reach patients, which is then again closer to public health and healthcare systems. And the fact that these two are part of the same equations, I think that idea is still lacking. And in that respect, it's very telling that the European Health Union is very strictly defined by the European Commission. It's defined as the pillars that they have proposed. So it is indeed the pharmaceutical package. It's the additional competences for the European Medicine Center and the European Center for Disease Control. It's the cancer plan. It's the health data space, which, don't get me wrong, are very important. However, that more holistic approach and that broader definition of European Health Union is needed. So for that reason, the European Policy Center has set up a project where actually only last week we proposed recommendations, also in light of the European elections next year, because we feel it's very important to indeed have that broader vision on health. And for the sake of discussion, because I am very much looking forward also to the expertise of the audience and to your questions, I just would like to mention a few recommendations. One of the first to start, and again, that really touches on that broader context, is the fact that the Versailles Declaration, which has been adopted in March 2022 by the heads of state, speaks about the importance of, and I'm quoting here, making Europe a leader in biomedicines. However, the roadmap to achieve that and also the more practical milestones to achieve that goal are completely missing. So there seems to be a disconnect between the different levels that need to be involved to make this a reality. I think the fact that also in order to make that a reality, we need to speed up access to finance and increase investment in research is completely absent from the roadmap. And I think if you link that to the need for more innovation, the need to invest also in a data infrastructure, where of course the European health data space is just one of the first data spaces that the Commission is intending to launch, I think it's very important to indeed keep working on these elements as well. As I said before, one needs to have the skills to indeed continue having clinical trials in Europe to make sure that also the health workforce is able to administer new innovation, new medicines to patients. So again, we need to be conscious of the fact that the health workforce is already overstretched, as we have seen since COVID-19, and that we need to keep working on this. Even though it's perhaps a European competence, we need to also keep this on the European agenda, also in light of the 2024 elections. But for the sake of time, because Neil, I know that this is intended as an introduction, so I'm trying to keep my time. I think it's also important indeed to go more specifically about the assessment of the potential impact of the EU pharma legislation, and perhaps more specifically on clinical trials and also clinical trial funding, as you have asked me. And I think when it comes to numbers, Europe is a region with active clinical trial involvement, with about 1/3 of patients in global clinical trials coming from Europe. However, I think it's also important to realize that Europe is not great, and I'm trying to be diplomatic here, in doing phase 1 trials, with only around 80 trials ongoing compared to more than 300 in both North America and Asia. So again, I think that is important to mention before we go into the impact of a regulation. And I have been speaking to a lot of different stakeholders because, again, we are a think tank. So it's not that we have specific expertise on clinical trials. But from stakeholders, I get the impression that perhaps the pharma legislation will perhaps not have that much of an impact per se, although I'm going to go into a few areas where I believe that the pharmaceutical strategy could be more specific. But I think the full and efficient implementation of the clinical trials regulation is perhaps the very first step to indeed increase the amount of clinical trials coming to Europe. And what I'm hearing from stakeholders is that especially interface issues with in vitro diagnostic regulation is an issue that needs to be solved very quickly, because I believe that's currently delaying the start of clinical trials. And of course, that's very detrimental of also the amount of clinical trials being undertaken in Europe. And I have to say that as a European, it really pains me if I hear companies saying that actually they'd rather prefer to go to China or other parts of the world to do their clinical trials because the market is so much bigger, regulations are so much easier. So I think, again, as Europeans, and now also with the opportunity of having European pharmaceutical package being revised, I think there are a few principles that could, and in my opinion, should be emphasized more in the proposal. I think public funds for clinical trials are key to ensure qualitative and evidence-based medicine. And I think also market access, and I think that also comes to the point of affordability of medicines. Market access should be supported by sound evidence for clinical utility of new medicines. And I think we really need more independent research focused on treatment optimization and ensuring that actually new innovation coming to the market is also having an added value and a benefit compared to the products already on the market. And I think also therefore perhaps creating more of a level playing field between the generic sector and innovative sector is very important to support repurposing studies, because I know from different stakeholders that repurposing really is still an issue, especially for older or old off-patent drugs, where I believe it's very important to boost therapeutic progress. And academic research plays a crucial role in repurposing studies. So I think they can really deliver a more sustainable, innovative, and also affordable element of improving access to treatments. And I believe that there are elements in the current proposal that may already be improving this, but I believe they can be dealt with and formulated in a much stronger way, because we all know how negotiations work. A lot of MEPs will propose amendments. They will come from both the generic sector and the innovative sector. And I think we have to avoid, and I know that very well from my member state experience, that we end up with a compromise that stakeholders and also patient representatives cannot work with because of the fact that the wording isn't clear enough. So I think the wording around repurposing should be really clear.
Mm.
I believe that you also wanted to come back to the element of the regulatory data protection system. I think perhaps in short, because I'm sure that also other speakers are going to go into that, I think it is really important that the wording around regulatory data protection strikes a balance between the interest of the generic as well as the innovative pharmaceutical industry. Because I know that the innovative industry probably says that it requires time to develop a drug and that needs to be rewarded. However, we also have seen in the past that data protection is sometimes used as a mean to block, let's say, the generic industry from generic entry to the market. And I think a level playing field is very important there. And also perhaps a global level playing field. I know that that's a very different issue and a very difficult issue. But again, industries playing divide and conquer between Europe and the rest of the world, I think is not something that we should be in favor of. So I think it's definitely something to consider when it comes to this specific part of the regulation.
Okay.
I'm going to end, because I think that I'm also ending my time and leave room for the other speakers, with the importance of indeed the implementation of the current clinical trials regulation. I believe it's really important to have more coordination between the multiple regulatory agencies, ethics committees, and notified bodies. And I believe that really requires a huge mind shift of the different stakeholders involved. And I believe that the creation of the European Medicines Agency, of the ACT EU, and combined projects are important steps into that direction. But also, for example, the fact that around 2,000 ongoing clinical trials have to be transitioned into the new clinical trials regulation framework is something that should be done fast. And where also all member states should ensure adherence to avoid any bottlenecks in that process. I think a last thing is that one of the bottlenecks and the importance of the harmonization of ethics committees requirements, that would be very important to further streamline and simplify their interactions within the clinical trial system. So again, the harmonization of the ethics committees, because I know from my past that there has been a huge issue during the negotiations, and I believe that will be very important need if that could be streamlined going forward. So I stop here and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. That's tremendously helpful context. And certainly what I take, one of the things I take from what you're saying here is the need for clarity, both at the high sort of strategic level, those critical interfaces with important other policy developments such as the EU health digital space, for example, but also greater clarity as well as some of the details so that the concepts are well honed by the time the legislation is approved. That's really important, I think, on both counts. The policy recommendations you said have been recently developed at the centre, are they in the public domain? Can people get that from going to the website at the moment?
Absolutely. They are available on the website of the European Policy Center. And I'm also very happy to send them to you so that indeed you would be able to disseminate them within your stakeholders network.
Thank you so much. I'm sure people will want to take a closer look. You've piqued our interest on so many accounts there. So thank you very much, Elizabeth. I'll come back to you later on in this discussion. Super, thank you. So one of the issues which we at the European Alliance for Patient Access are really concerned about in the context of clinical trials is around enrolment and how many trials fail because of lack of success in enrolment. But equally important, of course, is the concept of accelerating the path to approval. And I think we have a few better speakers who could address this topic than our next, Annette Backer, if we can just move the slide on, thank you, who, as you can see, is president of the Children's Tumour Foundation, but chair of the CTF's European board. So, Annette, I'll simply hand over to you, please.
Thank you so much. First of all, pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me. And if we can go to the next slide. So what I was thinking to do is to quickly maybe just set the scene of how the world looks now, and then turn the world just a little bit upside down. So we all agree definitely that research and development is slow and expensive, and you go to Google and you find all these things, these little diagrams that show that it takes years and it's complicated. And then if you look a little bit at the potential reasons, there is that all the stakeholders have different agendas, whether it's pharma, academia, clinics. Then often, especially when you go into clinical trials, in the hospital systems are all just a little bit different or between the nations. So systems are not always compatible. And then as we know, and I think Elizabeth pointed it out, that we really need money to do clinical trials. And there is still some risk aversion here where investors are still coming and saying, come to us when you have phase 2 data, which is then we don't need it anymore, right? So if we go to the next slide. Adding up to that, and our foundation, I will tell you in a minute, is focused on a rare disease. But in rare disease, the situation is even more complicated because if you see on the left hand of the slide, rare disease, you have few patients, which requires multi-site trials. And of course, in Europe, will require international trials between different nations, which means that the recruitment times can be really long. And As we know, it's about 30% of the clinical trials in rare disease fail because they don't recruit the patients in time. And then, of course, the usual very long and sometimes painful negotiations. And then on top of that, for rare disease, these diseases are very often progressive and heterogeneous and multi-organ, which means that you have different manifestations at different ages. So the protocols are really very complicated. So if we go to the next slide, what the world has done to still attract pharmaceutical companies to this rather complicated space in rare disease is they have all these additional, let's say, I call them magnets, right, to make rare disease sexy, with market exclusivity, orphan drug designation, prime, breakthrough, regulatory protection. But what is interesting here is that all these extensions of protection are after drug approval. So when the European pharmaceutical legislation came out, questioning some of these magnets, if you want, we started thinking as an organization, and if you go to the next slide, and we are used to turn the world a little bit upside down, and we was like, hey, and what if we get faster to approval? So instead of protecting after, can we shorten the timeline to approval? So you go to the next slide. So first, maybe just a minute about the disease we're working on, which is neurofibromatosis. And I don't want you to read the entire slide, but in yellow, just highlighting exactly the point that we're struggling with rare disease. Few patients, multiple organs, very different manifestations. The fact that not only do we need different sites, but also very different potential specialties, right? People are coming from the ophthalmology all the way to the oncology field. You go to the next slide. So our foundation has a very clear mission. Foundations have a very clear mission, is to drive research, expand knowledge, and advanced care for the NF community. And as you can see, we have all the, I always say we have all the fancy words, but we're actually not just talking, we're doing. And if you want to, our tagline is really also connecting the unconnected, and there is a little YouTube video that explained how we still respect scientific investment, but that we're really focused on how do we get these scientific discoveries as quickly as possible to the clinic. And on the next slide, I can just show you a quick example. Oh no, this is still what I will be focusing on today. So our strategy is for today, I will just be focusing on the developable treatments and on how can we accelerate clinical trials. If you go to the next slide. So this is an example that we have been developing, of course, in very strong collaboration with the field. We built a strong preclinical pipeline, and it was really driven by patients who said, I don't know, if I read in one paper, it says that this drug is supposed to work, and if I read another paper, it says that it's not working. So we threw out a call to the community and said, fix this. We want one answer. Is this drug working or not? So they put together a very comprehensive preclinical pipeline that they worked on for 3 years. That pipeline, in fact, led to the discovery of very surprising molecules such as brigatinib, which nobody thought would ever work for this condition. And then that has led to the creation of the first ever platform trial for this condition, where you look at multiple drugs for multiple indications at the same time. And that is run in 6 sites and it's co-funded between CTF and Takeda. If you go to the next slide. We did it not just once, but twice. So the foundation had invested in another big preclinical platform called the Preclinical Consortium, and I'm more than happy to talk to anyone who wants to know more about this. But the whole idea is to bring academic labs together who will test drugs in multiple animal models at the same time. All that same idea is how can we identify quickly what works and what doesn't work. And that, as you can see, has led to the first ever drug approval. And if you can see the little boy, Philip Moss, who agreed to be on the picture here, you see how he looked in 2015, and now he is a college boy, so with no tumor in his neck anymore. So on the next slide. That has led to we have become quite attractive as a community. We've now quite some clinical trials, 10 companies. We have a global infrastructure really to make it easy for pharmaceutical companies to enter into the space. And I always say, the dinner table is set, right? You bring your drugs, you bring some funding, and we can very quickly bring your assets from identification all the way through the clinic. And I think that will help us get drug approvals faster. On the next slide. So what is our next step? We're actually now building an NF-focused preclinical hub, and that is to really offer to pharmaceutical companies. One, we will help them identify which assets could be of value to NF. And I can tell you that every company that has an oncology portfolio has drugs that are interested for NF. Then we will go to them and say, this is a drug that we would be interested in, or this is a set of drugs we would be interested in. Number two, this is the menu that we have for you that we know in collaboration with the EMA and the FDA that is needed in order for you to get this drug to the clinic. And then we will, and I will tell you in a minute, then we will also make sure that we have a easy way to get them through the clinic. So why is this accelerating? On the next slide. Because we will make sure that we have that menu set, that we have all the agreements with both academic and CROs pre-negotiated, so we don't need to lose any time when the drug comes in to quickly bring that drug to the clinic. And then one of our staff members, who is really an expert in NF, will actually help companies select the right assets, the right assays to bring these and select the right drug quickly. So that is a first time saver to quickly get to approval. The next slide. Just a quick thing where we stand. We've identified the first partners. We have a first master service agreement with an academic lab who is willing to test drugs without strings attached, pre-negotiated. So if a company comes in, we can immediately bring that drug to that academic lab. And now we have sent out an appeal to the academic labs, actually yesterday, to ask who plays. And then we are having a big outreach to private partners to really build that public-private partnership. And then, of course, we're hard working on securing the funding to make sure that this preclinical hub can operate in the beginning completely funded by the foundation. And over time, the idea would be that we would create some kind of plug and play, some kind of supermarket for pharmaceutical companies to get their drugs quickly assessed through this preclinical hub. To the next, so that is bringing drugs to the clinic. So on the next slide, now we have these drugs. We know that in the traditional clinical trial setting, and EU Pearl has made a very nice little video to explain what platform trials are actually. But I think this diagram depicts it sufficiently that in a traditional world, every drug requires its own clinical trial with its own control group, which of course takes forever because every time you have a new drug, you have to start all over again. A platform, and this is now a platform basket trial because we're looking at multiple drugs, but in NF, we also look at multiple manifestations at the same time. So now you can see that you can in fact plug in multiple drugs into that platform in that basket trial very efficiently, and you can also adapt it over time, which means that if new drugs come in, you can easily plug them into the platform trial. And that is exactly what we have done for Intuit in the US already. And then on the next slide, we have been really lucky to be part of a pretty impressive EU Pearl, European IMI grant, where we worked with many partners, pharma and private and public, to develop platform trials for NF. And I always say the architectural work is done now. So let's say the design is ready. And now yesterday, we signed an agreement with the Global Coalition for Adaptive Research, who really will be the implementer of this. So they're kind of the construction company to make sure that these platform trials are not just a white paper, but that they actually will become a reality for the patients. I think to Elizabeth's point, what is going to be really interesting and really important is that very often the funding is there for conceptual constructions of things. But now we really need to get funding, and we need to start thinking about funding sources to let's say, to get the rubber hit the road, right? To get the drugs and to run the trials to show that we can actually do this. On the next slide. Why is this again another time saver? Because the interesting thing with platform trials is that your patients are pre-recruited, which means that they are in some kind of natural history study recruited to the master protocol, which means that the patient, you don't, let's say, lose time on patient recruitment, because the patients are not only part of the trial, but they are also involved, and which I think is really important as a patient organization. The problem with the traditional trials is that the trial is completely designed by one part of the world, the clinicians in the pharmaceutical companies, and then patients get invited at the last moment. Instead of being part of the show, they get invited, and then at that time they say, no, I'm not participating because I don't see the value. Whereas if your patients are part of the design or part of the endpoints, are really buying into the platform trial or into the clinical trial, you get much faster enrollments because your patients know and are bought into the concept. The second, of course, major advantage, again, is that all the agreements, multi-site agreements, international agreements are all in place, which, as we all know, takes a hell of a lot of time. And then the last one is we have the master protocol, which stays the same. So you actually only have to insert the drug application, which of course is still work, but it allows you to insert the drug applications, to plug it into the master protocol. On the next slide. Where do we stand now? For the EU Pearl, the master protocol has been finished and was a huge endeavor, a couple of years, but it was very good and even very constructive. We agreed on endpoints across nations. It was a very international and collaborative grant. The partners have been identified. So we've signed an agreement with GCAR, who will implement the platform trial. We have some sites that we're talking to now to be part of it. And now we're, of course, in conversations with the principal investigators, with the committee structures. And then, of course, a big thing here is we need to figure out how we can secure funding for that. Because, again, the original idea is that the foundations, the public, or let's say the philanthropic funders, will kick this off and we'll make sure that this really becomes a successful endeavor. And then we will invite the companies to come in and plug and play and pay to participate into these clinical trials. GCAR has done it for glioblastoma with the Agile trial. So we're pretty confident that we can do this again. On the next slide. I really want to thank you and invite you to join our movement and as I said, turn the world upside down and let's shorten the path to approval. And please, please, please reach out if you're interested to talk, to learn, to participate, and to teach us. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Annette. I'm sure that will resonate with many people. And it's great to have a model of proactive patient engagement in the clinical development context that's already been shown to be effective. Very often, patient advocates in the AAFPA network are raising the issue that, you know, these days more and more pharmaceutical companies are involving patients around the time they've already developed the protocols and they're about to launch the study and so on. But actually, even that can be too late, because what you need to be doing is making sure the product that planned, you know, is under development is premised entirely on unmet need. And the only way you're going to get that right is by involving patients almost at the pre-stage. So I think a lot of people will take a lot of things away from what you said. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. I mean, I've had a conversation with one of the parents who said in this clinical protocol, they ask so that that my kid would have an MRI every 3 months, for example. And the parent said, my kid is 2. I'm not going to anesthetize or let my kid be anesthetized every 3 months for the next 2 years just to finish the clinical trial. So I'm not participating. And I think having that information very early and if patients participate in both the endpoints and in the clinical trial design, now you have a group of patients that buy in and your patient recruitment will just, you just are in a very different space.
Yeah, great example. Thank you. Thank you so much. Okay, in the interest of time, we need to move straight on to our next speaker. And it's my pleasure to introduce Patrick Stockerbrandt, who, as you can see, is from the Centre for European Policy. and about to address another perspective here, which is crucially important, that of competitiveness in clinical research. Patrick, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. Yes, I'll, for the sake of discussion time, I'll keep it short and brief, and any question we can follow up afterwards. So maybe you can go to the next slide. What I want to do today, just very briefly go through what the reform is about, what the pharmaceutical legislation reform is about, where it touches upon clinical trials, then pick up what has already been partly discussed or talked about today, the regulatory data protection incentive, and then come to a conclusion, which is also a basis for discussion later. Next slide, please. So as you're all aware, over the years, there has been a growing number of various regulations and directives. At its core, what I call here the core pharmaceutical legislation, we have the community code that most of us are aware. We have the regulation on union procedures 726/2004, the regulation on orphan medicinal products, and regulation of medicinal products for pediatric use. And the next slide, please. And what the reform does now, it's repealing that core legislation and updating and adapting its regulation into two new comprehensive laws. So on the one hand, we'll keep the two-tier system of a regulation and a directive, a regulation with the union procedures, which I will call regulation proposal, and the union code, as we all know from today's law, which I call directive proposal. So, and apart from these new basic laws, as I might call them, we have additionally amendments to the regulation on advanced therapy medicinal products, then also what we've briefly touched upon, the regulation on clinical trials, and the regulation on reinforced role of the EMA, which was introduced after COVID-19. Next slide, please. So generally, the most important legal basis with regard to clinical trials is and remains the clinical trials regulation. It replaces the previous clinical trials directive, and it harmonizes the legal provisions for the conduct of clinical trials in Europe. Its application is now mandatory in all member states, but we still have not there's still transitional provisions that apply. So the last date that we are looking for is January 31st, 2025 for its full engagement, if I may say so. The next slide, please. So changes to the CTR, the clinical trials regulation through the reform, there are very little direct legal changes. They include mainly a new legal basis for environmental risk assessment for investigational medicines containing or consisting of genetically modified organisms. We have some changes to language requirements and a new legal basis for delegated acts by the Commission. That's roughly the gist of what the CTR is going to be adapted to. Next slide, please. Beyond this, the reform includes provisions on pediatric clinical trials, Article 94 of the regulation proposal, and then two aspects that may be also very interesting today to discuss, the introduction of regulatory sandboxes. We know these sandboxes or the technique behind it from other fields of law or other fields of policy, especially finance. They are firstly introduced to the medical or pharmaceutical sphere here. So what are sandboxes? They want to provide a structure for experimentation, especially using digitalization, AI, machine learning, and so on, with regard to discovery, development, and administration of new medicines. So what does it mean? Well, it's sort of a, if I may say so, it's meant to be a sort of a safe space. where certain legal freedoms are given to get a project going. Yeah, so innovations can temporarily be tested through these sandboxes under real conditions in a legally secure and delimited area, without having to fulfill all regulatory requirements right from the start. But today, with the little time that is left, I would like to take a minute to discuss the incentives to conduct comparative trials, which was also addressed right at the beginning of today. So this is about the extension of regulatory data protection period. And I will talk about it on the next slide, please. So the regulatory data protection is a period of exclusivity during which generally a generic or biosimilar competitor cannot rely on the originated company's data to seek its own marketing authorization. And what the reform does, it sets out the standard RDP time to 6 years. That's a reduction of 2 years compared to today's time. And what the incentives model is, it's sort of a cumulative incentives approach. Yes, as you've already indicated, there are certain conditions, and if you fulfill them, among them, if you do comparative clinical trials, you'll get additional time for RDP. Yeah, and maybe most interesting today is if you do comparative clinical trials, you are getting, or the marketing authorization holder will get 6 additional months to the RDP, so 6 years plus 6 months. Next slide, please. So wrapping up and already sort of going into the discussion, the reform itself does not include very many direct elements to change clinical trial law. Among the few elements to support advancement, I think, are the regulatory sandboxes and the incentives. Now, it would be interesting to further talk about if that incentive, which is there to conduct comparative clinical trials, 6 additional months of RDP, is it really effective? Does it have a substantial effect of gathering or getting more comparative trials in Europe? I doubt it, but let's discuss it. And to finish up with the more broader sense, is, so what is the overall impact on EU competitiveness in clinical research? It's already been indicating today from the colleagues, and I think so too, that the reform as it stands doesn't have a substantial impact on that issue. There's a lot of, we are covering some technical issues, but when you look at the bigger picture, to me, I think, and I'll be happy to discuss this, I think four issues need to be addressed further when we look at the bigger picture. And these four issues, I think, is enhancing cooperation within the EU in health policy matters. We kind of had a little bit on that already. 2, reducing bureaucracy costs. 3, and that is really, really needed, improving digitalization. And 4, accelerate regulatory administrative decisions. And we kind of had a little bit discussed this today too. So I think that these 4 elements would help Europe become more competitive and attractive for research and development in general, which would then have a more lasting and a bigger impact with regard to global competitiveness of the EU when it comes to clinical, or to attracting further and more clinical research in Europe. I was very fast. I hope I wasn't too fast. Thank you very much for the opportunity, and I stand ready for any question and the discussion. Looking forward to it. Thank you.
Beautifully timed, Patrick, because it was so clear. I think you took all of us with you. And clearly, big questions to be addressed and discussed, a lot of uncertainty, which is one of the risk factors, but also opportunities, clearly. So a common theme amongst all three presentations, I think. Thank you so much for clarifying that so nicely. We are running short of time, so I'd like to introduce Julie Sponny, please, from the European Patients Forum. Julie, like the rest of us, you've heard that. You've obviously been thinking about the issue a bit or a lot over recent times at EPF. Just a couple of minutes, please, if you can, just to sort of give top line some first responses or whatever messages you'd like to deliver here from a patient perspective. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Neil, and thank you for the invitation. Yeah, I would be happy to give you some insights into the patient perspective on this issue that were mentioned, but also on additional insights on the impact of the pharma legislation on clinical trials. So within the patient community I represent, we see this revision as a unique opportunity to make clinical trials more patient-centered and also to improve patient access to safe, effective, and high-quality medicines. I would start by mentioning that we see the revision as an opportunity to ensure that the authorized medicines will respond to patients' needs, because we are calling for patient-relevant outcomes and other patient experience data to be included in the marketing authorization dossier. And this would oblige pharmaceutical companies to really fully involve patients from the start and in the design of the studies. We also think that considering the added value of the medicine from early on at the marketing authorization stage is crucial, and that it will reduce the time between the marketing authorization and actual patient access. Because as you may know, and it wasn't mentioned during the presentation, but the scientific evidence required for marketing authorization is often considered insufficient by HTA agencies assessors. Which leads to delays and inefficiencies. So that's why the proposal of the Commission to incentivize comparative clinical trials can encourage alignment with data requirements in HTA processes. But for that, we think that the comparator in comparative clinical trials should meet the requirements in HTA processes. Thirdly, it was mentioned by Aneta, but the accelerated pathways that are planned in the proposed legislation, such as temporary marketing authorization and PRIME, will faster time to approval. However, some adaptive pathways are linked to meeting an unmet medical need, and this is where we are concerned at EPF, because the proposed definition is making a strong link between mortality and morbidity and ignores important factors for the patient community, such as the quality of life or the appropriateness of existing treatments. And last but not least, I would like quickly to respond to what have been said on the competitiveness of the EU and the impact of a review of the pharma legislation. Like the other panelists rightly said, we need to strike a right balance between incentivizing R&D products that provide a real added benefit to patients and access to new therapies. But I would like to go a step further the debate on regulatory data protection periods, because for us, an enabling environment for innovation is not only about RDP, but it includes other criteria such as reduced bureaucracy, faster approvals, or strong patient involvement. That's why we're very pleased to see in the legislation that there's an increased involvement of patients in the regulatory process, because patient involvement improves the outcomes of the regulatory decisions and ultimately contribute to the quality of evaluation of medicines and their outcomes. And it can have an impact on clinical research in Europe and on innovation in Europe. But we think that the EU should go a step further and really lead the way in patient involvement. So voila, that was a brief overview of our position on all the issues that were mentioned, and I'm looking forward to the rest of the discussion.
Thank you so much, Julie. That was fantastic. And thank you for being able to respond kind of so spontaneously to what's been said as well. Much appreciated. So I'm sure we all agree the patient perspective is critical here. So I'd just like to see if any of our speakers would like to respond to anything that Julie just mentioned there. Yes, please, Annette.
Yeah, I so agree with Julie that I think we need to absolutely, especially when it comes to unmet medical need, we have been hammering throughout this entire process to ask the patients if for everything in the world we get a survey, right? Do you prefer peanut butter or strawberry jam? But then when it comes to healthcare, other people are deciding for us. It just doesn't make sense. So I so agree, Julie, with that point. And then the other question I think that was made before around the fact that is the 6 months enough for the extra protection when we are doing these adaptive trials? I don't think so. I completely agree with you. I don't think so. I think we need to, if we want to do people to do something different, we really need to move the foot in the corner where we want them to be, but put some proper foot.
And thank you very much, Annette. Absolutely. And Elizabeth, if I could come to you from your perspective, where you have more of a kind of perhaps an overview of the issue and take account of a range of stakeholders. What do you think about the role of advocacy groups, including patient organisations, in this debate? To what extent do you think those groups are engaged? Should they be more engaged, or is it an issue that they need to come to down the line?
Well, I think that's a very good question. And I think over the years, things have been improved. As I said, I mean, I still remember when I started educating myself on clinical trials in general back in, I think it was 2010, when we started going from the clinical trials directive to negotiating the clinical trial regulation. And I think that back in the days, in some member states, I think there was patient involvement. But because of the fact that the rules weren't that much streamlined, there were big differences. And I believe, and Julie, I think you have very rightly put it out, patient involvement has been improved, but I think still, of course, not all patient organizations have the right resources to really come in and play the role that they wanted to play. So, for example, one of my questions to Julie also was this idea of regulatory sandboxes. As interesting as it sounds conceptually, but would you really have the resources to engage in it? And therefore, it sounds interesting, but is it really going to bring added value? Question mark.
Does the EPF have a view on sandboxes yet, Julie? I'd be impressed if they have.
We do, yeah. The question of resources is very topical, and we are asked to be more and more involved, but we have less and less resources. So, yeah, we are going to advocate, and we're already advocating for patient involvement to be fairly compensated. When it comes to regulatory sandboxes, it's still not really defined and not clear how it will work in practice in the legislation. So for now, our main position is that it will provide access to faster access to medicines to patients, but patient safety must remain at core, and we need to be involved if it concerns, because it will concern patients. But like I said, it brings back to the question of resources, and as you rightly put, so we don't have many.
Thank you. And Patrick, if I could just turn to you on the issue, developing this point around multi-stakeholder involvement and potentially, partnering within that. Do you see much of a role here for public-private partnerships or collaborations to ensure that stakeholders are sort of joined up? We've seen the EU over the years take tentative steps in the direction towards supporting more of that through, innovative medicines initiatives, and now the IHI following on. Do you think that sort of model has a role to play in this debate to help get the legislation right here?
I do. It's one of the ways. I don't think there's in German you would say there's no Königsweg. There's no one road that you can take. And I think it's such an important issue that we need to explore all these aspects. And public-private partnerships are a good tool for that. And we have the problem. When we come to health policy, we are still divided. Yeah, we have 27 different health policies and a European health policy. And it's sometimes, after COVID, there was a big getting together and let's do it together and let's face certain health policy issues together. But if we remind ourselves about the time before 2020, 2019, any health policy file is medical devices direction, and so on. HTA, the HTA dossier was difficult to agree upon with the member states, among the member states. So there has been a momentum to work together in health policy issues, and that was one of the key elements that I wanted to bring along. Is that I think in times of poly crisis and in the times that we are living today, we substantially gain from working together, and we should use all the tools that are there and legally feasible for that. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much. So we're running very slightly over time. If people can, and I speak to the audience here as well, hang on for maybe a couple of minutes. We'll wrap up by 5 past the hour. But I just want to come back to each of the 3 speakers with the same question, if I may, actually, putting you on the spot a little bit to our 3 presenters. We've heard a lot about, a whole range of issues, opportunities, risks, challenges, uncertainties. So I'd just like to ask each speaker to highlight maybe one issue which they see as a major risk or a major opportunity, and if possible, a policy recommendation or an approach to addressing the policy issue that is most needed at the moment to address that challenge or opportunity. So randomly, I'll put Elizabeth on the spot first, please.
Well, thank you, Neil. I think that's quite a challenge to do that in basically a few seconds. I think I go for the need for more public-private collaboration. Because again, we have seen over the years that there is a lot of differences and a lot of initiatives in both the public and the private sector. But I think we need to have more public funds as well for clinical trials. And we need to ensure indeed that the public and the private sector are working together, perhaps in a better way. That there's more initiative where they can work together.
Sure. Very clear. Thank you. Annette, please.
I can summarize it in 2 words. We don't have a clinical trial if we don't have drugs and we don't have money. So I think those are probably the biggest challenges. I think and I really like what Patrick was saying, like how can we incentivize? Because I'm very focused on not blaming anybody, but can we create incentives so companies do the same things? To Elizabeth's points, how can we find the funding to run those clinical trials, respecting everybody's IP, right? So I think there is some work that needs to happen to make sure that we can do it. But I'm a very big believer in the coalition of the willing. And I think if we can get the right champions at the table, and this, by the way, is an invitation to the entire pharma sector, I think we can do it. And with the investment community, let's not underestimate them. Guys, get less risk averse. If you don't take risk, we will never win. So this is a world message to everybody, actually.
Drugs, money, and maybe we add people as well in it, given the enrollment issues. Absolutely.
I think we know, but I think that, I hope, and I think Julie is right, but I hope that we will be able to successfully start including patients much earlier.
Yeah.
Consider to the patients, I think the message is so clear. You are the client of healthcare. You are the client of what we're doing. And the client is the king. And that is the message that we should give to our patients as well. You're not a victim. You're a research partner. Sit at the table, right? Be trained to understand the language. It's a double responsibility. It's also the responsibility of the patient to step forward and say, I want to be part of this.
Yeah. It's okay to talk the message of patient empowerment, but there comes a time you have to deliver
in 2 directions. We have to teach the clinicians to listen to the patients, and we have to teach the patients to talk to the clinicians. And I think if we solve that, and I think in NF we've been pretty good at it, but I think this is something that will be super important.
Absolutely. Thank you. And Patrick, what would you like to highlight in my 1-sentence challenge?
My colleagues said all the most important things. Maybe I just add one more dimension to it. I think digitalization is one of the key aspects, and we need to. There's a lot of technical issues that we still need to think about on the EHDS, but it is it can be a game changer for Europe and the world. And I think we need to strive to find a good common way to make that happen.
Thank you. Julie, is there one sentence you wanted to add, or did you cover that with the previous intervention?
No, I mean, it was covered by Annette, but I can only second what she said, that we need patient involvement and more patient empowerment at all stages of the process.
Sure. Thank you. Well, thank you all so much, and thank you, the audience, for joining with us today. As I think you said earlier, Annette, this sort of major overhaul of such important and far-reaching legislation only comes around once in a generation or so. So it's absolutely imperative that stakeholders raise their voices, right? And that's really why we at the European Alliance for Patient Access are promoting and trying to stimulate this conversation and bring stakeholders together. The consultation period has been extended, but it's a healthy democratic process, isn't it? If real listening is going on, and that listening is going to be informed all the more richly if informed views are expressed during the process. So there's a lot at stake. There's a lot of good that could come from this, and there are clearly some risks. We at the European and Global Alliance for Patient Access will be continuing our clinical trials initiative into next year, maybe beyond. We're here and open to work with all of you, including the audience, on any issues you might like to raise with us. We're always happy to explore synergies, but I think we've covered a lot of ground today, and I just want to thank our speakers for helping cover it so clearly. Thank you, one and all, including everybody in the audience, for giving your precious time today. And if you want to go to gafpa.org to see what resources we have there, you are very welcome. Thank you, and have a great rest of the day.